This is all wrong. I shouldn't be up here. I should be back in school on the other side of the ocean. Yet you all come to us young people for hope. How dare you!
Boring. Boring. Boring.
Okay, you got it. Don't tell us what we're gonna feel. We're trying to solve a problem. Don't tell us what we're going to feel.
I'm not telling you.
Because you're in no position to dictate that.
That's exactly what you're doing.
You're in no position to dictate what we're going to feel.
I call again for an immediate ceasefire in Gaza, the return of the sausages, the hostages.
Welcome, Lembit and Öpik here on Lembit and Öpik Live on Unprecedented TV. So glad you could join us, where we find the facts, kill the spin, and tell it like it is as best we can. Thank you for your subscription, which is free. If you subscribe to the YouTube channel, that's really great. It helps us, as many of you already have. Do please keep it coming, and do please feel free to repost. We're delighted when you share this broadcast with others. Today, I want to talk about two things. Briefly about the Home Secretary, Shabana Mahmood, who claims that she's got a plan to deal with essentially uncontrolled migration into this country. I have to say I was quite impressed by what I heard, which will probably make me unpopular with you because many of you think she's terrible. But I'll talk about that with my guest in a moment. And then the main event today. The United States, if you're watching this live, the United States has sent envoys to Ukraine against a backdrop when apparently there have been private talks between America and Russia to see if they can end the war in Ukraine. This has caused some consternation. Bleating voices from Europe say, oh, you can't do it without us. I think they can, actually. And the same goes for Zelensky. My view is that they're both pretty irrelevant, actually. The only two games in town are the Russian game and the American game. I think that Ukraine will have to do what it's told. But how much longer will the killing continue? Does Ukraine have to surrender? And what does this look like in the long term? All of these questions I will go through with my guests. My guest, Macus Papadopoulos, Dr. Macus Papadopoulos, in just a moment. But you can have your say as well. Do please go and give your comments if you can, if you want to. You'd be most welcome to do that. In the meantime, let me introduce my guest and see how he's doing. Marcus, good to see you. How are you doing?
I'm very well, Lembit, and thank you as always for having me on your show. It's always a delight because candid talk is a fundamental tenet of democracy, in spite of what the British ruling elite and its useful idiots claim.
It's very flattering of you to say that, but I always enjoy your company, and we'll have to get together before Christmas to have a one-on-one discussion. Maybe we should secretly film it, and then it'll go viral if people think that we didn't know it was being filmed. Big picture story here. Before we go into the main story, Shabana Mahmood, she did quite an interesting interview with the BBC. I actually used the F word on a breakfast program, which surprised me because I didn't think they were allowed to do that kind of thing. But leaving that aside, she seems to be taking a rather sterner view of migration. And she had an interesting argument. I think she's Muslim and I think she's Pakistani, but she said that she would have a better time of it, and the indigenous Pakistani community in the country would have a better time of it if migration was improved, because there'd be less rage. What do you make of her?
Well, Lembit, let me be frank. As always, the monarchic British state has no intention whatsoever to tackle illegal immigration or to reform the immigration system, in spite of what its useful idiots claim. If we are to truly understand what is happening in Britain, we must firstly understand the actual structure of power in the country, meaning that the likes of Starmer and Mahmoud and Cooper are not in charge. Secondly, once we have determined the actual structure of power in Britain, then we must determine the nature of the people who rule Britain. Only then will we be able to understand, to fully understand what the agenda of the monarchic British state is. And that is why I say there is no intention to stop illegal immigration or to stop legal immigration. No one in the cabinet, be it the Home Secretary or the Justice Secretary, determines policy. The people who are in charge of each and every government department are the permanent undersecretaries, and the permanent undersecretaries come from the heart of the British ruling elite. They are selected by the heart of the British ruling elite, and they are put in those positions by the heart of the British ruling elite to ensure that the agenda is followed. It makes no difference what Starmer or the Home Secretary or the Justice Secretary says on BBC News or Sky News or Channel 4 News or whatnot about tackling illegal and legal immigration. That is simply for public consumption. That is simply a way of trying to appeal to the British people that, quote, we are serious about doing something to reform immigration. In reality, all of these people are useful idiots. They are self-serving, useful idiots. There was never a plan, a quote, Rwanda plan. There was never any other plan to deal with illegal or legal immigration. Again, to understand what is happening, we must understand the actual structure of power in Britain and also in the rest of the Western world, because the whole of the Western world is experiencing the same problems. That is not a coincidence. That is because the people who rule Britain are essentially part of the same club who rule America, who rule Canada, who rule Britain, who rule Sweden. And they are all experiencing the same things. And their politicians, their self-serving, useful idiots, also go on television and say, we are determined to deal with the problem of immigration, legal and illegal. But Lembit, nothing ever happens.
So you don't really have faith in statements like this refugee status to become temporary and some condition where you have to be here 20 years before you can have permanent status. Those sound quite specific to me.
Not at all. I have absolutely no faith because, again, I understand what the agenda is. I understand that these MPs amount to nothing. If they want to tackle illegal immigration, then deploy the Royal Navy, deploy the police to Dover and other British ports, deploy the secret police, MI5, to tackle illegal immigration. That is how you tackle a crime. A crime. These people who are coming across the English Channel, and they're not doing it by themselves. Again, they are being brought here. They are being imported. If you want to tackle that problem, then you utilize the Navy, you utilize the police, and you utilize the secret police, and also you utilize the army, because the protection of, or the security of Britain's borders, including maritime waters, is down to the British armed forces, and yet they're not being deployed. So if you want to tackle illegal immigration, you deploy the military, including the Navy, the police, and the secret police. But they won't do that.
Well, I set a hair running there, really, because the main thing I want to talk about with you is Ukraine. But I can see that maybe next week we should talk specifically about this issue. I'm often told that I was too soft for politics because I see the best in everyone. I want Mahmoud to do a good job. I want to like her. I can't bring myself to like Starmer. I think the man's just irredeemably dreadful, really, as a prime minister. We'll see what happens, and it's interesting that there's quite a lot going on when it comes to the status of the prime minister, and I'm wondering if actually there's going to be a lot of problems there for him quite soon, because there's even a way in potentially for, in my view, his biggest threat, and that's Andy Burnham to stand for Parliament. So, right, let's get to the big story now. As I said before, it looks to me that Americans have gone to Ukraine to tell Zelensky what he has to do. I've never taken Zelensky seriously as a politician. I don't think he's got the capability, really, to be a politician. It takes decades to learn the job, and he spent his decades being a professional clown. And now he's running a war badly. But the Donbass, I think, is often being talked about. This is a look at Ukraine. And essentially, Ukraine's been losing all the way. My feeling, just starting with the big picture, and we can go to the smaller picture, my feeling is this, that the Russians made 3 demands. No NATO in Ukraine, a demilitarized Ukraine, and a denazified Ukraine. Now, those don't sound too bad to me, because the first and the third ones are obvious. It was James Baker in 1990 who promised that NATO would never try to take Ukraine and lots of other places into its ambit. If there is no Nazification in Ukraine, then they can agree to that. If there is, they should get rid of it. So the only sticking point, as far as I could see, is how militaristic Ukraine should be. But it seems to me the West refuses this. Now, I suppose it ties in a little bit to what you said before about migration, but where do you stand? Where do you stand on this, Marcus?
Well, first of all, yes, in 1990, the then US Secretary of State, James Baker, along with George Bush Sr., told Mikhail Gorbachev that in return for the Soviet Union consenting to the reunification of Germany, NATO would not move 1 inch eastwards beyond Germany's borders. Now, that is a documented, irrefutable fact, but alas, Gorbachev, being the idiot that he was, did not get the Western leaders, did not get NATO to put this assurance into writing. So it was simply an oral assurance. Fast forward to the present day, I have no idea as to whether these reports about the latest peace plan for Ukraine are credible. I am aware that the Daily Telegraph in the UK is leading on this story. I am also aware that the Daily Telegraph is as big an enemy to the British people as the Guardian is. The Daily Telegraph likes to refer to patriots and nationalists in Britain as far right. So no one should attach any importance to the Daily Telegraph. But let us just assume that there is a new peace plan on the table for Ukraine. Anyone who is familiar with Russia, Russian history, the Russian mindset, anyone who is familiar with the lands which comprise the Ukraine will tell you that under no circumstances will the Russian military campaign come to an end unless NATO puts into writing that Ukraine will never be admitted as a member, unless Ukraine is demilitarized, and unless Ukraine is denazified. Now, I say that the Kremlin will never consent to anything but those things. However, even if NATO was to put into writing that NATO would admit admit Ukraine into its military bloc, you cannot trust one word which comes out of the mouths of the NATO leadership, which is essentially the Western ruling elite. Because in 5 years' time, in 10 years' time, they could renege on that agreement by saying, we have detected an aggressive policy emerging in the Kremlin, and therefore it is imperative that Ukraine is admitted as a member. So the sad reality, Lembit, is that the war will continue. The Russian military were deployed to Ukraine not only to ensure that Ukraine would never be admitted as a member of NATO, because in such a scenario, Russian national security would face, in my opinion, an unprecedented threat. But also the Russian military was deployed to Ukraine to gather what the Kremlin and the average Russian believes as being lost Russian lands. We must never forget that in March of 1991, the population of what was then known as the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic voted overwhelmingly, over 70%, to remain a part of the Soviet Union. So that is something that Western mainstream media naturally will not talk about. Where NATO is popular is in Eastern Galicia, Lvov, Ternopil, and Ivano-Frankivsk, and also in Rivne and the other places that are right on the border with Poland. So again, I wish the war would come to an end, but now that the Russian military is in Ukraine, it will not cease.
Let's talk about the actual status of the war in a moment. But one point I think that I can elucidate on, I have actually seen the memo in which James Baker is quoted as saying not 1 inch to the east, that there is a written memo of it. And I believe that to be quite salient, because the apologists for NATO expansionism pretend that it was never said. Everybody knows, anyone who studies it knows that there was a promise made to Mikhail Gorbachev, and perhaps you're right, it should have been formalized more. But by any measure of the spirit of the situation, it's quite clear that the West lied to the former Soviet Union. And my personal feeling is that it's quite clear, those three conditions, quite clear that Russia is just trying to sort out a particular running sore, which was predicted even in a film by Oliver Stone. You could say, oh, he was just a shill for Russia. Well, actually, I found the film quite persuasive. So I do think that we've created the problem. The West has created the problem for itself, and it's clearly trying to create a ring of NATO right around Russia. I'd be pretty angry if somebody was trying to do that to me. Let's carry on in just a minute. Before we go any further, though, Tim Scott's back. He's going to be doing Tim Scott Uncancelled. We'll be talking about the plans for that show shortly. Watch this. So that's Tim Scott Uncancelled, back with all guns blazing, hopefully in a victorious fashion, showing you the stories that you may have missed in the mainstream media, the media which Marcus isn't too impressed with, nor am I. I often say, Marcus, we don't want to beat the mainstream media, we want to be the mainstream media, and that's a story for another time. Let's think about the war itself. It's really not going very well for Ukraine, as far as I can see. They're being pretty much flattened. I'm actually surprised that more civilians aren't being killed. There's been another strike. If you're watching this live, apparently 24 Ukrainians were killed. And this whole thing seems so brutal, Marcus. I cannot see why anyone thinks Ukraine, with its semi-pensioner army, can possibly defeat the might of one of the most powerful fighting forces and one of the most experienced fighting forces in the world, namely the Russian army. From a military point of view, whichever side you're on, no one can seriously believe Ukraine can win this, can they?
Well, first of all, we have to understand that the Western ruling elites, the dark, malignant entities which rule the Western world, are psychopathic killers. They care nothing for the population of Ukraine. They care nothing for the population of the countries which they rule. Let us not forget that the monarchic British state provides £1 billion a month to illegal immigrants and foreign nationals, and yet couldn't care less about old age pensioners freezing to death. They couldn't care less about homeless veterans. They couldn't care less about children living in poverty. So that is the true nature of the monarchic British state and the Western ruling elite as a whole. When it comes to Ukraine, the reason why they are persisting with this war is simple. Yes, it is a money laundering exercise. The Western ruling elites are the biggest organized crime syndicate in the world. But there is another reason, and a more important reason. The Western ruling elites are very conscious that Russia is the only country in the world that can stand up to them, that can literally destroy them, because the Russian nuclear arsenal is the largest and the most formidable in the world. That is why, following the dissolution of the Soviet Union, plans were in place in Washington and in London to exploit Russia's weaknesses following the end of the Soviet Union to expand NATO up to the Russian border. Because a Russia which is isolated in Europe is a Russia which is weakened in Europe and weakened in the world as a whole. And if Ukraine was ever to be admitted to NATO, then Russian national security would be in serious peril. That is why they are persisting with this war, and they will continue to persist. They will fight to the last blood of each and every Ukrainian. And I believe if they had their own way, they would deploy women in Ukraine to the front line. Again, these are psychopathic killers. These are the same people who dropped depleted uranium on Serbia in 1999 when they were bombing Serbia in support of the so-called Kosovo Liberation Army, a terrorist organization, an organized crime syndicate that deals in, amongst other things, organ trafficking. So they will persist in the hope that they can somehow defeat the Russian military, but it is a fanciful hope, and they know that. And regardless of what the likes of John Healey has to say, the British Defence Secretary, he knows as much about military matters as I know about trade in Timbuktu in the 16th century. Again, he's a self-serving, useful idiot. So this war will continue. However, Lembit, it could end very soon. Why? Because there is a major manpower shortage in Ukraine. Well over 1 million Ukrainian men have died or have been seriously wounded. And many, many men in Ukraine are fleeing the country because they do not wish to be a part of this war. So it could be, Lembit, one day we wake up and the front line in Ukraine has collapsed and the Russians are advancing without any resistance.
It does seem to me that they have a huge problem now. Warren Thornton, a regular contributor to Unprecedented TV, estimates that for every Russian that's killed, roughly 18 Ukrainians are killed. And his estimate is that over 2 million Ukrainians, mainly men, have been killed. And there are some fairly strong circumstantial reasons for believing that figure is correct. And even more, obviously, if it's not correct, why would they be sending people in their 60s to the front line with a couple of weeks training? You're not going to do too well against the might of the Russian army. If you're 63 years old, you've had 2 weeks training and you've got a gammy leg. I mean, it's just ridiculous. But the tragic thing is, I wonder what you think about this. it's obvious that eventually Ukraine will have to sue for peace. It won't be Ukraine because Zelensky is not a serious person, but America will have to sue for peace on Ukraine's behalf. And I'm just wondering, why is it not obvious that they're going to have to give up? They could at least save a couple of 100,000 lives by doing it now.
They don't care about human lives. These people are psychopathic killers. They have demonstrated this on countless occasions. Will a scenario emerge where America sues for peace? It's possible, but I think unlikely. The Kremlin will, or let's be more precise now, Putin will never, ever trust a word which emanates from the mouths of Western capitals, be it Washington or London or Brussels. Because let us not forget, initially in his first tenure, he wanted an equal relationship, an equal strategic partnership between America and Russia. Indeed, Putin put to Clinton in 2000 the possibility of Russia joining NATO. And of course, Clinton dismissed that. In the 1950s, the Soviet Union asked NATO to be admitted, for the Soviet Union to be admitted as a member. And of course, NATO said no, which tells you something about the plans of NATO. So Putin will never trust anything that comes out of the mouths of the Western ruling elites. And the only way that Putin, the Russian government as a whole, and the Russian people as a whole can ensure that Russian security in the south, what I call Russia's soft underbelly, namely Ukraine, the only way to ensure that there can never be a threat there is to ensure that the Russian military either captures all or most of the country. And that is the way I believe the war will end. I have been saying that for nearly 4 years now. And I don't say this in an arrogant way, Lembit, but if you have a look at all of my television interviews since February 2022 and podcast interviews, overwhelmingly, I have been proven right. And indeed, since 2007, I had been warning in newspaper articles and on television and radio and speeches that there would be a war in Ukraine, and it would be a horrific war, and it would be a war which is caused because of NATO expansion. And in regard to the difference in power between the Ukrainian or NATO's Ukrainian military and the Russian military, well, the Russian military is a superpower. The Russian military can call up 23 million soldiers if need be. Now, it's not going to do that. It would only do that in a war with America. But that just goes to show the Russians could lose 100,000 soldiers in 1 year, dead soldiers, 200,000 dead soldiers. They can just call up another 100,000, another 200,000. And the most important aspect to it is this: the average Russian person will say this to anyone in the world, Lembit: everything and anything for Mother Russia, for the motherland. If we have to lose 5 million of our men in Ukraine, then we will do that to ensure the security of the motherland. The Russians sacrificed 27 million of its people to defeat the Wehrmacht. They will do it again. The Russian mindset, the Russian soul is not like the British mindset or the British soul or the American mindset or the French mindset, etc., etc. It's very different. And unless people understand that, they will never truly understand why the Russians are in Ukraine and why the Russians will do anything to ensure that they are victorious there.
It's worth noting, as I did on a show this week, that the entire full-time British Army, excluding the volunteers, the reserves, the entire British Army, the regulars, would fit into Wembley Stadium, and there'd still be 15,000 seats free. It's preposterous. I actually find it almost embarrassing when I listen to government ministers in Britain talking about supporting Ukraine and sending our people over as peacekeeping forces. They can't even defend the channel. But the position you take, and you do take a forceful position, and you are consistent on this, it seems to be that the West doesn't really care about Ukrainian deaths. They want to tie up Russia in Ukraine because it's convenient for Western interests, but they haven't really got a chance of winning. I'd be inclined to agree with all of that, which leads to, I suppose, the concluding part of our conversation today. What is America doing potentially behind closed doors with Russia? Because, once again, call me naive, I thought that Trump is so desperate to prove that he is the peacemaker, that he does want to have that peace in Ukraine, and he's willing to do whatever trade is necessary to achieve it.
I believe that Trump has no interest in Ukraine and regards it as being of no importance to America and the American people. So he's not beholden to Ukraine. He is, however, beholden to Israel, which is another story. But I believe that behind closed doors, and I have put this theory of mine out since the start of this year, I believe that there is a secret agreement between the Trump administration and the Kremlin. I believe that the agreement revolves around something like this, that Russia will be given a free hand in Ukraine, meaning that Russia will be allowed to take either all or probably most of Ukraine, at least 70% of the country. And in return, the Russians will give something to the Americans. Now, in order to disguise that, or in order for the Trump administration to disguise that, they have to create a smokescreen. Thus, peace plans, thus a peace discussion in the White House, which we saw this August, and so on and so on. Nothing ever comes of these peace plans, partly because Russia, as I have already said, will not trust a word which comes from peace plans. But also, I do believe that there is some sort of secret agreement. And if you accept that premise, then it explains all that we are seeing. Now, the American deep state will not be happy with that. There is a tussle for power between the Trump administration and the deep state, and of course, the British deep state. But again, Lembit, I am sad to say this, but the killing will continue. And you have to blame the Western ruling elites for this.
The thing is that if we can get that picture up again, thanks. The thing is, I would have assumed that Russia would consider a reasonable buffer zone to be those areas there, Crimea, which they've already got, Kherson, Zaporizhzhia, Donetsk, Luhansk, and they might go a bit further. But I thought that would be winnable by Russia, and it would be manageable by Russia, and it would be give-upable by Trump. You don't agree?
If you can if you're able to keep that map up, so to people listening to this, if you look at the map, the Russian military will advance to the west of Kiev. Again, on the map, to the west of Kiev. The Russian military will go as far as regions called Zhytomyr and Vinnytsia, which is to the west of Kiev on that map. And they will advance all the way down to Odessa. That would give the Russians control of approximately 70% of Ukraine. Under no circumstances would Russia sit back and say, yes, we're content with Lugansk, Donetsk, Zaporozhye, and Kherson. No, because if that was to happen, and if one day Ukraine was to be admitted into NATO, then NATO tactical aircraft operating, let's say, from Kharkov or Sumy, would be able to reach Moscow in something like 10 to 12 minutes. The rest of Ukraine would be littered with NATO soldiers and later NATO hardware and NATO strategic missiles. Odessa and Ochakov would become NATO ports. So no chance will the Kremlin accept what it has at the moment? No, it will go just beyond the westward point of Kiev on that map. And I will say this, Lembit, and I haven't said this before, I would bet my life on it. That's what the Russians will do.
That's a pretty big statement. Don't want you to bet your life on it. It's possible that you're right, but we won't charge you a pound of flesh if you're wrong. It's an interesting position. It would explain why Russia's quite willing to continue the war, which they're clearly winning. There is absolutely no prospect whatever. I've said this many times before, and I'll say it again. No prospect whatever of Ukraine winning a military victory. It's impossible. Impossible. And with the level of corruption that seems to be endemic to Ukraine and its military and everything else, it makes it even less likely. How long, though, if with your theory, how long do you think it will take them to occupy all of that area? You said that it's possible that if the defenses collapse where they are now, they could make pretty plain sailing of it.
Yes.
But, well, you've got winter, makes the ground hard, but also makes the ground more difficult to navigate. How long would it take them to take all that land?
Well, if the front line was to collapse, if the Ukrainian army was literally just to fall apart, then in order to capture Nikolaev and Odessa in the south, and then to advance beyond the Dnipro River all the way to Zhytomyr and Vinnytsia, then the Russians could do it in less than a year. You know, there would be no doubt some resistance still there,
Yeah.
but yes, in less than a year. We should also be mindful that the Russian military is now in the oblast of Dnipropetrovsk. Now, that is an oblast that the Kremlin officially has not laid claim to, but they will. Once the Russian military enters Nikolaev in the south, the Kremlin will lay claim to that. Once it enters Odessa, it will lay claim to that. The Russian military is also in Kharkov. So that is how the Kremlin is managing the war, and that is how the Kremlin will finish the war.
You imply then that you reckon there's at least a year left in this war.
Well, that's that's on the basis that the front line is to collapse. If, of course, it doesn't collapse, then yes, it can go on for longer, because there are still a lot of men in Ukraine who can be sent to the front line. You know, not that many, but there's still a fairly significant percentage who can be sent there. And of course, the men in Eastern Galicia will be very happy to fight against the Russian military, but the population in Eastern Galicia is, pales in comparison to the population in the rest of Ukraine.
It does seem to me, though, that the fighting spirit is not necessarily with the Ukrainians, that Russia is in charge of this horrendous meat grinder, where it has to be said the overwhelming majority of victims are military personnel, even though they've been conscripted in large part, some civilian deaths. But it just seems to me that Russia is unstoppable. And I just wonder if you're being overly pessimistic about Donald Trump's willingness just to get this done so that he can move on to other things.
I'm not being pessimistic about Trump. I'm being realistic about the Kremlin. I understand what the lands which comprise Ukraine mean to the Russian people. It's sacred territory. It is sacred Orthodox territory. It is sacred Russian territory. It is full of the blood of the Soviet army in World War II, who defended the Ukraine against the Wehrmacht and who then liberated the Ukraine from the Wehrmacht. It means everything to the Russian people. So I'm not being pessimistic about Trump, but even if there was a peace plan where Ukraine is demilitarized, Ukraine is denazified, and it is put into writing that Ukraine will never be admitted to NATO, the Russians would not stop their campaign, because the Russians will never take any risks again. Because now that the Russian military is in Ukraine, here is the opportunity for Russia and the Russian people to ensure that these lands in Ukraine return to Russia, and in doing so, ensure the security of the motherland.
Very, as always, very eruditely and clearly spoken. Just a quick hello to Kyra in Ireland, who's watching. I think I really want to see if I could get you to have a chat with Warren Thornton at some point. He's a very interesting fellow, and I think you and he have quite a lot in common, because you both have roughly the same time scale envisioned for this conflict, and both of you have the view that Russia wants more land and it will take it. I just simply add one more thing before we finish. This was all avoidable if the West kept its moral promise to Russia. I've been heavily criticized, not so much now, but 2 or 3 years ago, heavily criticized for saying this, but you could see it was going to happen, because Russia said, don't do this, don't do it, don't do it. And of course, then they took Crimea and said, there's more. And we ignored it, because we have rank amateurs. I did actually have one more question. We only got a couple of minutes. I take it you agree with me that Europe is utterly irrelevant in these discussions.
Well, first of all, you were heavily criticized, Lembit, for expressing an alternative opinion. How wonderful it is to live in a democracy. In regard to the European Union is simply a weapon of the Western ruling elites. It is the EU commissioners, European members of parliament. They amount to nothing. The people who are calling the shots in the European Union are the Western ruling elites. They do not like Trump. Trump certainly doesn't like the European Union. So in all of this, the EU has no leverage whatsoever. It does as it's told. And we must never lose sight of the fact that the EU is not Europe. Europe is most certainly not the EU. EU values are not European values, and European values are most certainly not EU values.
Yeah, there's a whole debate to be had about that. I'm inclined to agree with you. I have to say, no one inspires less confidence in the European project than Ursula von der Leyen for me. Thank you so much. That is Dr. Marcus Papadopoulos. Thank you very much for watching. Have your say. You can also subscribe to us at YouTube, Unprecedented TV, and please do subscribe. It really helps us a lot. Doesn't cost you anything, but the more subscribers we have, the more we can do. So thank you very much indeed. I'm Lembit Öpik. That was Lembit Öpik live here on Unprecedented TV. If you've got program ideas, let us know, and I'm looking forward to a whole new set of programs coming from America. That's called Good Morning USA. We're very close to starting that too. Thanks very much indeed. Have a good day.
Immediate ceasefire in Gaza. The return of the sausages.